The guitar stopped. The harmonica went silent. And Bob Dylan heard words he'd spent 20 years trying not to hear. It was a small club. The Bitter End in Greenwich Village. November 1978. Maybe 70 people in the room. Wood-paneled walls. Low ceiling. Tables crowded close to a stage that was barely elevated, just a wooden platform, a single microphone, a stool, and a man with a guitar. Bob Dylan wasn't supposed to be there. He'd been on hiatus. Taking time away from the machine that had consumed his 20s and most of his 30s. Away from the expectations, the labels, the voices telling him what his music meant, what he represented, who he was supposed to be. But sometimes a man needs to play. Not for an arena. Not for the journalists, or the critics, or the people who would dissect every word for political meaning. Just play. Small room. Old songs. People who were there because they wanted to hear music, not because they wanted to witness history. Dylan had been playing for 40 minutes. Mostly older material. Songs from the early 60s that felt like they belonged to someone else now. His voice was rougher than it had been 15 years ago. His face more weathered. The curly-haired troubadour who'd marched with movements and dated Joan Baez was gone, replaced by this tired man who just wanted to get through a song without carrying the weight of a generation. He finished. "Don't think twice, it's all right." Scattered applause. He reached for his harmonica, fitting it into the holder around his neck. His fingers found the opening chords of the next song. And then he heard it. A voice from the front row. An old man. Maybe 70. Wearing a worn work jacket and a face that had seen too much. "Play the Ballad of Hollis Brown." Dylan's fingers stopped on the guitar strings. He didn't look up. The audience waited for the next song to begin. The old man spoke again, louder this time. Not aggressive. Just insistent. "Please! Play the Ballad of Hollis Brown. For my son." That night, in a small club, Dylan was singing when an elderly man in the front row said one sentence. Dylan went silent, his eyes filled with tears, and that song was never heard again. Dylan's hands remained frozen on the guitar. He stared at his fingers like they belonged to someone else. The room had gone completely quiet. Even the bartender in the back had stopped moving. The Ballad of Hollis Brown. Dylan hadn't played that song in 12 years. Maybe longer. He'd written it in 1962. A story song about a South Dakota farmer who couldn't feed his family, couldn't pay his debts, couldn't see any way out except violence. 7 shots rang out. A family destroyed. A system that ground people into dust. It was one of Dylan's protest songs from the era when people still called him a protest singer. Before he went electric. Before he rejected the labels. Before he told everyone to stop looking to him for answers. He'd stopped playing it because it was too heavy. Because people died in that song. Because it wasn't metaphor, it was real. Farmers in the 60s were killing themselves. Families were starving. And Dylan had written a song about it, and people had applauded, and nothing had changed. He'd stopped playing it because carrying other people's pain in 3-minute songs had nearly destroyed him. Now this old man in the front row was asking for it. For his son. Dylan looked up. Made eye contact with the man for the first time. Saw the grief written across his weathered face. Saw the desperate hope that maybe, somehow, a song could mean something. Could honor something. Could make a death less meaningless. "Your son," Dylan said quietly, his voice barely reaching beyond the front row. The old man nodded. "Thomas. He was a farmer. Nebraska. The man's voice broke. "It was like your song. Exactly like your song. Bank foreclosed. Couldn't feed his kids. Last year. He did what Hollis Brown did." The room was so silent that the sound of Dylan setting his guitar down on the stage seemed to echo. He didn't say anything. He just sat there on his stool, harmonica still hanging around his neck, looking at this old man who had buried his son. Dylan didn't explain himself. He never did. Someone in the back coughed. Another person shifted in their chair. But mostly, 70 people held their breath and waited to see what Bob Dylan would do with this moment. Dylan had spent 20 years learning how to not be responsible for other people's pain. How to not let every sad story in America become his burden to carry. How to write songs without becoming a martyr to them. But this wasn't America's pain. This wasn't a movement, or a cause or a political statement. This was one old man who had lost his son, and that son had died the same way a character in a Bob Dylan song had died 16 years ago, and the father had come to this club hoping that maybe the man who wrote that song would understand. Dylan stood up slowly. He stepped off the small stage, just one step down, and walked to the edge of the front row. The old man looked up at him, eyes wet, waiting. "What was his name?" Dylan asked. "Thomas. Thomas Brennan." "How old?" 37. 3 kids. Wife left him 6 months before. Bank took the farm his daddy had given him. He held on as long as he could. And then... The old man couldn't finish. Dylan nodded slowly. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a pen. He took one of the club's cocktail napkins from a nearby table and wrote something on it. Then he folded it and handed it to the old man. "I can't play that song tonight," Dylan said, his voice rough, barely controlled. "I'm sorry. I can't. But this is for Thomas." The old man took the napkin with shaking hands. He didn't open it. He just held it against his chest and nodded, tears streaming down his weathered face. Dylan walked back to the stage. He picked up his guitar. The audience waited, confused, moved, unsure what they just witnessed. Dylan didn't explain. He just started playing the next song. Something lighter. Something that wouldn't carry the weight of a father's grief. The show continued. Dylan played for another 30 minutes. When he finished, he set down his guitar, nodded to the audience, and walked off stage without encore. The old man stayed in his seat long after everyone else had left. The napkin still pressed against his chest. The bartender was cleaning up when he finally stood to leave. On his way out, the old man unfolded the napkin and read what Bob Dylan had written. "Some stories are too heavy for songs. Thomas deserved more than I could give him. I'm sorry. BD. Subscribe and leave a comment, because the most important part of this story is still unfolding. To understand what happened in that club, you need to understand what Bob Dylan had been carrying since 1962. The Ballad of Hollis wasn't just a song. It was based on real events, composite stories Dylan had heard from farmers in the Midwest, from people who'd written him letters, from newspaper clippings about men who'd reached the end. Dylan was 21 when he wrote it. Young enough to think songs could change things. Young enough to believe that if he sang about injustice loudly enough, someone would fix it. By the mid-60s, Dylan was drowning. Everyone wanted a piece of him. The folk movement wanted him to stay pure. The activists wanted him to lead marches. The media wanted him to explain what his lyrics meant. The fans wanted him to solve their problems with 3-chord progressions and poetic metaphors. And Dylan had realized something that terrified him. Songs don't fix anything. They just make the pain visible. And sometimes, making pain visible without being able to fix it is worse than silence. So he'd stopped. Stopped playing the protest songs. Stopped being the voice of a generation. Went electric at Newport in 1965 and let the folk purists boo him off stage. Released albums that confused everyone. Retreated to Woodstock. Had a motorcycle accident that may or may not have been as serious as reported but gave him an excuse to disappear. By 1978, Bob Dylan had learned how to protect himself. How to perform without bleeding out on stage. How to write songs that didn't require him to carry other people's suffering. And then Thomas Brennan's father had walked into the bitter end and asked him to play the one song Dylan couldn't sing anymore. Away from the spotlight, Dylan made a choice no one expected. After that night, Dylan didn't talk about what happened. The show wasn't recorded. No journalists were there. Just 70 people who'd witnessed something intimate and painful and real. But word spread the way these things do. Someone told someone who told someone. Within folk music circles, people started talking about the night Bob Dylan refused to play the Ballad of Hollis Brown for a grieving father. Some people said he was cold, that he owed it to the man to play the song. That wasn't asking much, just 6 minutes, just one song. Others understood. Dylan had given more of himself to his music than most artists ever do. And sometimes the kindest thing you can do is refuse to reduce someone's pain to entertainment, even well-meaning entertainment. 3 weeks after that night, Dylan was in his Malibu home when a letter arrived. No return address. Inside was a photocopy of a newspaper obituary. Thomas Michael Brennan, 37, of Hayes County, Nebraska, died November 3, 1977. He is survived by his father, Michael Brennan, his 3 children, and his former wife. Services were held at St. Mary's Catholic Church. In lieu of flowers, the family asked that donations be made to the Farm Crisis Hotline. Tucked into the envelope was a note in shaky handwriting. Mr. Dylan, you were right. Some stories are too heavy for songs. But thank you for seeing my son. For knowing his name. That mattered more than the music ever could. Michael Brennan. Dylan kept that letter. Not in a frame. Not displayed anywhere. Just in a drawer in his desk where he kept things that mattered. And he never played the Ballad of Hollis Brown again. What followed stayed with everyone who witnessed it, long after the sound faded. Years later, decades later, people who had been in the bitter end that night would tell the story. Usually late at night, in quiet conversations with other musicians or old fans. They'd talk about the moment Bob Dylan stepped off the stage and stood face to face with a man whose son had died. They'd talk about how Dylan could have played the song. How it would have been easier to just play it. How the audience would have wept and applauded and felt like they'd witnessed something meaningful. But Dylan hadn't done that. He'd done something harder. He'd refused to make Thomas Brennan's death into a moment. Refused to let it become just another performance, another story to tell, another line in the folk music mythology. Instead, he'd written a few words on a napkin and walked away. Some stories are too heavy for songs. In 1984, Dylan released an album called Real Live. In the liner notes, buried among the technical credits, was a single-line dedication. For Thomas. No last name. No explanation. Just those 2 words that only a handful of people would understand. Michael Brennan died in 1989. His obituary mentioned that he was survived by 3 grandchildren and that he'd been a lifelong fan of folk music. It didn't mention the night he'd asked Bob Dylan to play a song, or the napkin he'd kept in his wallet until the day he died. But his daughter, Thomas's sister, knew. She'd heard the story. And when she went through her father's belongings after the funeral, she found it. The folded cocktail napkin, worn soft from years of being carried, with Bob Dylan's handwriting barely visible. She donated it to the Woody Guthrie Archives. It sits there now, in a preservation folder, with a note explaining its significance. Evidence that sometimes the most important moment in music history is the song that didn't get played. Share and subscribe. Some stories deserve to be remembered. Bob Dylan is 83 years old now. He still tours. Still plays. Still refuses to explain his songs or defend his choices or tell people what his music means. In all those years, through all those concerts, he has never played the Ballad of Hollis Brown again. Not once. Because some songs aren't meant to be sung. Some griefs are too specific, too sacred, too real to be performed. And sometimes, the greatest act of respect an artist can offer is silence. Share and subscribe. Some stories deserve to be remembered. Dylan never spoke publicly about that night. But those who know him say he still carries that napkin moment with him. Not the napkin itself. Michael Brennan kept that until he died. But the weight of it. The knowledge that he'd been asked to turn a man's death into a melody, and he'd chosen not to. In choosing silence, He'd honored Thomas Brennan more than any song ever could. That's the Bob Dylan people don't see. Not the icon. Not the voice of a generation. Just a man who understood that sometimes the music has to stop for the truth to be heard. The guitar stayed silent that night. And it stayed silent for Thomas. Forever.